Blood smells exactly like dirty pennies. Maeve knew this because she had spent her 20s scrubbing it off emergency room floors, and now it was soaking into the cheap linoleum of her diner at 3 a.m. A man in a ruined three-piece suit was dying in booth 4, bleeding out over the laminated dessert menu. His bodyguards were screaming. The paramedics weren't coming. She didn't want to save a mobster, but she really hated scrubbing stains out of vinyl. The bell above the glass door of Hank's diner didn't just ring, it shrieked. Maeve was halfway through wiping down the counter, the sour stench of stale coffee and industrial bleach clinging to her cuticles. Her lower back throbbed with a dull, familiar heat. The neon sign outside buzzed a relentless, stuttering pink, casting ugly shadows across the wet asphalt of the empty parking lot. It was 3 a.m. on a Tuesday. The only sound in the diner was the dying rattle of the refrigerator compressor and the relentless, driving rain slapping against the single-pane windows. Then came the crash. The front door slammed open, rebounding hard enough against the wall to crack the drywall. Wind howled into the room, scattering a stack of paper napkins like dead leaves. Maeve froze, the wet rag stalling on the Formica counter. 3 men stumbled out of the storm. 2 of them were upright, their faces pale and slick with rain. The third was dead weight, his arms draped over their shoulders, his feet dragging uselessly across the linoleum, leaving a thick, dark smear behind him. "Lock the door!" The taller of the 2 upright men barked. His voice was raw, frayed at the edges, with a panic that didn't belong in a man holding a matte black pistol. Maeve didn't move. Her heart gave one massive, painful thump against her ribs, then settled into a rapid, icy rhythm. Her eyes flicked instantly to the swinging doors of the kitchen. In the back office, curled on a camping cot beneath a scratchy wool blanket, was her 5-year-old son, Toby. "I said lock the fucking door!" The man aimed the gun at her. His hand was shaking violently. Maeve dropped the rag. She walked around the counter, her worn sneakers squeaking on the damp floor. She didn't look at the gun. She looked at the man's eyes, wide, white-rimmed, terrified. Terrified men with guns pulled triggers. She turned the deadbolt with a sharp click and pulled down the heavy metal blinds. "Put him in a booth," she said. Her voice was flat, empty. It surprised even her. They hauled the third man into booth 4. He collapsed onto the vinyl bench, his head lolling back against the glass. He was wearing a dark charcoal suit, the kind of wool that cost more than Maeve's car, but the left side of it was heavy, saturated, and shining black in the harsh fluorescent light. "Call a doctor," the younger enforcer pleaded, pressing his hands against the man's chest. "Call someone. He's bleeding out." Maeve stood 6 feet away, arms crossed, her fingernails biting into the fabric of her cheap pink uniform. She evaluated the dying man. He had a strong jaw covered in dark stubble, his skin currently the color of old ash, his chest hitched in a shallow, wet gasp. Blood was welling up from beneath his collar, spilling over the fabric of his shirt, dripping steadily onto the laminated menu on the table. Drip, drip. A heavy, thick sound. "You don't call an ambulance for that kind of mess," Maeve said softly. "You think I don't know that?" The older one snapped, wiping rain and sweat from his forehead, smearing blood across his own cheek. "Our guy is 20 minutes out. He's not going to make it 20 minutes. Do you have a first aid kit?" "For grease burns, not bullet holes." Maeve's eyes stayed on the dark pool expanding on the floor. The younger man sobbed, a pathetic, ugly sound. He was pressing a handful of flimsy, single-ply diner napkins against the dying man's collarbone. The paper instantly dissolved into red mush. "Dominic! Hey, Dom! Stay with me, boss!" Dominic. Maeve felt a cold spike of recognition. Dominic Varga. She didn't read the papers, but you didn't live in this city without knowing the name. He owned the shipping yards, the local judges, and apparently the absolute devotion of the two idiots currently letting him bleed to death in her diner. "You're pressing the wrong spot," Maeve heard herself say. She immediately bit her tongue. "Shut up, Maeve. Let him die. Let them leave." The man with the gun turned to her, his expression feral. "What did you say?" "He's pressing the wrong spot," she repeated, her voice void of emotion, even as her stomach churned. "The blood is bright red. It's pulsing. That's an arterial bleed. Probably the subclavian. Your buddy is pressing on the muscle, not the artery. He's just making a sponge out of napkins." The older man stared at her, the gun lowering an inch. "You a doctor?" "I was a trauma nurse," she lied. She was an ER tech who had been fired 2 years ago for swiping antibiotics for Toby from the dispensary. But they didn't need to know her resume. "And if you don't move out of the way, your boss is going to be a corpse in about 4 minutes. The man hesitated. He looked at Dominic, whose eyes had rolled back, showing thin crescents of white. His breathing was a horrific, rattling hiss. "Do it," the older man ordered. He stepped back, raising the gun again. "But if he stops breathing, I put a bullet in your face." "Understood." Maeve didn't look at the gun. She looked at the blood ruining her clean floor. She thought of Toby in the back room, sleeping through the storm. "Get me a clean apron and a roll of duct tape from behind the counter," she commanded, stepping forward. "And don't point that thing at me while I work. It pisses me off." The smell hit her first. Copper, rust, expensive sandalwood cologne, and the sharp, acidic tang of fear sweat. Maeve slid into the booth next to Dominic Varga. Up close, he was massive. His shoulders took up half the bench, and his body radiated a strange, damp heat. He was unconscious, his head tipped back, his lips tinted a pale, sickly blue. "Move!" She shoved the younger enforcer's hands away. She gripped the lapels of Dominic's ruined suit jacket and yanked outward. The fabric resisted, heavy with blood, but she managed to peel it back. His dress shirt was plastered to his skin. Maeve didn't hesitate. She grabbed the collar and ripped it down. Buttons pinged against the window pane like tiny hailstones. The wound was ugly. The bullet had entered just below the clavicle, tearing through muscle and nicking the subclavian artery. It wasn't a neat puncture. The flesh was jagged, bubbling with bright, frothy red blood with every weak beat of his heart. "Jesus!" The younger man gagged, turning away. Maeve felt the familiar, cold dissociation slide over her. The panic evaporated, replaced by a hyper-focused, mechanical calm. It was a survival mechanism she had honed over years of 12-hour ER shifts, dealing with gangbangers, car crash victims, and overdoses. The man on the table ceased to be a terrifying Mafia boss. He was simply a plumbing problem, a leak that needed plugging. "Tape," she snapped, holding her hand out blindly. The older man slapped a roll of silver duct tape into her palm. She tossed it onto the table. "I need the apron. Wad it up." She grabbed a bottle of cheap vodka they kept under the counter for the line cook's special coffees and unscrewed the cap with her teeth. She poured it directly over her hands, ignoring the stinging in her cracked cuticles, then splashed the rest directly into the wound. Dominic's entire body convulsed. A deep, guttural sound tore from his throat, more animal than human. His back arched off the vinyl seat. "Hold him down!" Maeve shouted. The two enforcers scrambled, pinning his shoulders and legs, but the man's strength was terrifying even at death's door. He thrashed, his good arm coming up to bat her away. Maeve threw her left knee over his waist, pinning his hip to the bench, and leaned her entire body weight forward. She didn't have gauze. She didn't have a hemostat. She had her fingers. She thrust her right hand directly into the torn flesh of his shoulder. The sensation was horrifying. It was hot, slick, and tight. She felt the rough edge of shattered bone, the slick pulse of muscle, and finally, the frantic, erratic thumping of the severed vessel. She pinched it. Hard. Pinching the artery against the clavicle with her thumb and forefinger, she dug in until her knuckles turned white. Dominic gasped, a wet, suffocating sound. His eyes snapped open. They weren't the clouded, panicked eyes of a dying man. They were sharp, dark brown, almost black, and glittering with a raw, agonizing clarity. He stared straight up at Maeve. She was straddling his hip, her uniform soaked in his blood, her hand buried inside his chest. For a second, the rest of the diner faded. There was only the harsh buzz of the neon sign outside and the ragged sound of their shared breathing. He didn't look at her with gratitude. He looked at her like a wolf caught in a steel trap, assessing the hunter who had just stumbled upon him. His jaw clenched tight enough to crack molars. He reached up, his large, blood-slicked hand wrapping around her left wrist. His grip was crushing. It felt like an iron band snapping shut. "Don't," Maeve whispered, her face inches from his. Her voice was trembling now, betraying the calm of her hands. "Don't fight me. You'll bleed out in seconds. Let go." Dominic's chest heaved. He stared at her mouth, then up to her eyes. He was searching for something. Panic, malice, a reason to snap her neck. Whatever he found in her, exhausted, heavily bagged eyes, seemed to placate him. Slowly, agonizingly, the grip on her wrist loosened. His hand dropped to the vinyl seat, his fingers curling into loose fists. His eyes slipped shut again. But he was breathing. The bleeding stopped. The younger enforcer whispered, peering over Maeve's shoulder like a frightened child. "I have the artery pinched," Maeve said, her voice tight with exertion. Her forearm was already cramping. The muscles in her hand screamed in protest. "But I can't hold it forever. I need to pack it. Give me the apron." The older man handed her a bundle of thick white cotton. "I'm going to pull my fingers out," Maeve told them, not caring if Dominic could hear her or not. "When I do, it's going to geyser. I need to shove this fabric deep into the wound cavity to create pressure against the back wall of the artery. Then we tape it down. Hard." "Will it hold?" the man with the gun asked. "Until your doctor gets here." "Maybe." "If he doesn't move," Maeve took a deep breath. She counted to 3 in her head. She ripped her hand out of the wound. Blood immediately surged, spilling warm and sticky over her wrists. She didn't hesitate. She jammed the wadded apron directly into the hole, pushing it down with the heel of her hand until she felt it hit the bone. Dominic groaned, a low, vibrating sound of pure agony. But he didn't wake up again. "Tape it," Maeve commanded, leaning her entire upper body onto her hands, using her body weight to keep the pressure localized. "Wrap it around his shoulder, under his armpit, back over his chest. Pull it as tight as you physically can. Do it now." The enforcers moved with frantic obedience. The sound of duct tape ripping off the roll was deafening in the quiet diner. They wound it around his torso, binding the thick cotton apron down until it looked like a crude, silver bulletproof vest. When they were done, Maeve slowly let up her weight. She pulled her hands back. The white apron was already blooming pink, but the violent, pulsing flow had stopped. It was contained. Maeve slid off the booth, her legs trembling so badly she nearly collapsed onto the linoleum. She caught herself on the edge of the table. Her hands were dyed crimson, the blood already drying tight and sticky on her skin. She looked down at her uniform. It was ruined. Her sneakers were ruined. The floor was a disaster. She felt a sudden, hysterical urge to cry, not out of fear, but sheer, unadulterated exhaustion. She had 4 hours left on her shift, and now she had to mop up Mafia blood. 20 minutes later, the storm had broken into a steady, miserable drizzle, and the cavalry arrived. The headlights of two massive black SUVs sliced through the gaps in the diner's blinds, casting long, sweeping shadows across the ceiling. Maeve sat at the counter, a lukewarm cup of tap water in her hands. She had washed her hands and arms up to the elbows in the kitchen sink, using dish soap and a scouring pad until her skin was raw and red. But she still smelled it. You never really get the smell of an arterial bleed out of your nose. The front door opened. This time there was no panic. 4 men entered in silence. They moved with a terrifying synchronized efficiency. 2 of them carried a collapsible medical stretcher. A third man, carrying a steel medical case, went straight to booth 4 and immediately began assessing the duct tape patch job. The 4th man walked toward the counter. He was older than the rest, maybe late 50s, with salt and pepper hair cut close to his scalp and a tailored trench coat that looked completely dry despite the rain. He walked with a slight limp, but his presence sucked the oxygen out of the room. The 2 frantic enforcers who had brought Dominic in practically shrank against the wall when he passed them. He stopped a few feet from Maeve. He looked at the floor, noting the bloody rags, the empty vodka bottle, the shattered glass from the door. Then he looked at her. His eyes were grey, flat, and entirely devoid of warmth. "You did this?" His voice was a low rumble, rough like gravel under tires. Maeve didn't stand up. She took a sip of her water. It tasted like ash. "If you mean saving your boss's life while your 2 guard dogs cried about it." "Yes," the man's eyebrow twitched. It was the only crack in his marble facade. He glanced over at the booth. The man with the medical case looked up and gave a single, curt nod. "He's stable." The older man turned back to Maeve. "My name is Elias. I handle Mr. Varga's complications." "I don't care who you are," Maeve said, setting the plastic cup down. Her adrenaline was crashing, leaving behind a hollow, aching fatigue. "I just want you out of my diner before my boss gets here at 6. I have a floor to bleach." Elias reached into the inner pocket of his trench coat. He pulled out a thick envelope, plain white and heavy. He tossed it onto the counter. It slid across the formica, stopping inches from Maeve's folded hands. "Compensation," Elias said softly, "for the ruined uniforms, the floor, and the absolute certainty that you will forget everything that happened here tonight. The storm blew out your window. A stray dog wandered in. You cut your hand on the glass. That is the story you will tell the police if they ask why there is a bullet hole in your wall." Maeve looked at the envelope. It was thick enough to choke a horse. There was easily $10,000 in there. Maybe more. It was a year's rent. It was a reliable car. It was kindergarten tuition for Toby. It was blood money. She didn't touch it. She looked up at Elias. "Take your boss and leave." Elias stared at her for a long, quiet moment. He was categorizing her, putting her in a box in his mind. Brave or stupid? "You saved his life," Elias said, his tone shifting, becoming something dangerously close to respectful. "Dominic Varga is not a man who forgets a debt. Neither am I. I didn't do it for a favor," Maeve said, her voice turning bitter. She jerked her chin toward the back room. "I did it because your boy put a gun to my head, and I have a kid sleeping in the back office. I did it to survive." Elias's gaze flicked to the kitchen doors, then back to her. Something dark and protective flashed in his grey eyes, gone as quickly as it appeared. A mother's instinct. "Very well. The money is yours regardless. Clean the floor. Keep your mouth shut. We will not trouble you again." He turned and walked away. In a matter of seconds, they had Dominic on the stretcher. As they hoisted him up, the movement shifted the heavy wool of his jacket. Dominic's head rolled to the side. For a brief, fleeting second, His dark eyes fluttered open. Across the diner, through the harsh fluorescent glare, his gaze locked onto Maeve. He was heavily sedated now, pumped full of morphine from the doctor's kit, but the look in his eyes was identical to the one he had given her when her hands were inside his chest. Searching, calculating, memorizing her face. Then, Elias stepped in front of him, breaking the line of sight. They carried him out into the rain. The SUVs started up with low, synchronized growls. Tires hissed on the wet pavement, and then they were gone. The diner was silent again, save for the rattle of the fridge and the hum of the neon sign. Maeve sat alone for a long time. She looked at her hands, clean, but still aching. She looked at the blood on the floor, now beginning to congeal into a dark, sticky syrup. Finally, she looked at the white envelope on the counter. The kitchen door creaked open. Maeve flinched, turning sharply. Toby stood in the doorway, clutching his faded blue dinosaur blanket. His dark curls were a messy halo around his sleep-flushed face. He rubbed his eyes with a small fist, blinking against the bright lights. "Mummy?" His high, reedy voice cut through the heavy silence. He pointed a little finger at the messy booth. "Did you drop the ketchup?" Maeve felt her throat close up. She forced a smile, pushing off the stool. Her legs felt like lead, but she crossed the room and picked him up, burying her face in his warm, sleepy neck. He smelled like baby shampoo and warm cotton. A desperate, fierce wave of protectiveness washed over her. "Yeah, baby," she whispered, her voice cracking. Mommy dropped the ketchup. "It's okay. Go back to sleep. I'll clean it up." She carried him back to the office, tucked him in, and kissed his forehead. When she walked back out into the diner, the exhaustion settled into her bones, heavy and permanent. She picked up the envelope. She didn't open it. She shoved it deep into the pocket of her jeans, ignoring the way it felt against her leg. Heavy, foreign, and dangerous. She walked to the janitor's closet, grabbed the heavy yellow mop bucket, and started running the hot water. She poured an excessive amount of bleach into the steaming water. The harsh, chemical burn of it filled the air, suffocating the smell of copper and cologne. She plunged the mop into the bucket, wrung it out, and began to scrub. She told herself Elias was right. She told herself she would clean the floor, keep the money, and never see Dominic Varga again. She told herself she had survived the night, and that was all that mattered. But as she watched the water in the bucket turn a deep, cloudy pink, Maeve knew, with a sinking, cynical certainty in her gut, that men like Dominic Varga didn't just walk away from debts, and women like her rarely got lucky enough to be forgotten. Paranoia has a distinct flavor. It tastes exactly like the metallic seal of the thick, white envelope Maeve had hidden at the very bottom of Toby's toy chest. 3 weeks had passed since the night the storm blew the doors off Hank's diner. 3 weeks of jumping every time a black SUV idled at a red light. 3 weeks of expecting men in trench coats to kick in the door of her cramped, second-story apartment. But nothing happened. The broken window at the diner had been patched with plywood, the blood scrubbed from the linoleum until the protective wax completely wore away, leaving a dull, scuffed patch near booth 4. She hadn't spent a single dollar of the cash. It felt radioactive. If she spent it, she acknowledged the transaction. If she acknowledged the transaction, she was part of their world. So, the money sat beneath a pile of plastic dinosaurs, and Maeve went back to pouring stale coffee for truck drivers. It was a Tuesday afternoon, 2:15 p.m., the post-lunch lull. The diner smelled heavily of old fryer grease and the sharp tang of window cleaner. Maeve was refilling the sugar dispensers, the repetitive motion numbing her exhausted brain. The little bell above the door chimed, a weak, polite jingle, nothing like the violent shriek of 3 weeks ago. She didn't look up immediately. "Take any seat," she called out, tapping a glass dispenser against the counter to settle the sugar. "I'll be right with you." The footsteps that followed didn't belong to a trucker in heavy boots or a local teenager in sneakers. It was the slow, deliberate, and irregular rhythm of hard-soled leather on linoleum. Step, drag, step, drag. Maeve turned around, a fistful of sugar packets in her hand. The packets hit the floor. He was standing 6 feet away. Dominic Varga. He looked worse than he had when he was bleeding out somehow. The sheer volume of blood loss had left a permanent, sallow greyness beneath his skin. He was wearing a dark navy overcoat that hung slightly too loose on his broad frame, leaning heavily on a black cane with a silver, unadorned handle. His left arm was tucked close to his chest, immobilized in a sleek black sling hidden beneath the coat. But his eyes were exactly the same, dark, calculating, and entirely too sharp for the cheap surroundings. He wasn't looking at her face. He was looking at the dull, scuffed patch of linoleum near booth 4. "You ruined the wax," he said. His voice was a low, resonant baritone, quiet but possessing an acoustic weight that made the hair on Maeve's arm stand up. Maeve stood frozen. Her heart didn't race. It plummeted into her stomach, a cold, heavy stone. "We're closed. The sign says open until 4, Dominic replied, slowly shifting his gaze from the floor to her face. He took another step forward, moving toward booth 4. He slid into the vinyl seat with a barely concealed grimace. The leather of his coat groaned against the plastic. "Black coffee? No sugar." Maeve looked at the empty diner. The cook was in the back, listening to a baseball game on a static-filled radio. They were alone in the front. She could run to the kitchen, lock the door, call the police. And tell them what? She thought bitterly. That the city's biggest crime boss ordered a coffee? She swallowed the dry lump in her throat, picked up the glass carafe from the burner, and walked over. She didn't offer him a menu. She didn't smile. She poured the steaming black liquid into a thick ceramic mug, her hand completely steady. It was the ER trauma reflex kicking in. Panic later. Function now. "The envelope was sufficient, I assume," Dominic said, watching the steam rise from his cup. He didn't reach for it. "Elias assured me you accepted the terms." "I took the money so you'd leave my diner," Maeve said, her voice flat, devoid of the deference a man like him expected. "I haven't spent it. You want it back? Give me 20 minutes to drive home." Dominic's lips twitched. It wasn't quite a smile. "I don't ask for refunds on my life, Maeve." She flinched at the sound of her name. Of course he knew it. He probably knew her social security number, her credit score, and what brand of cereal Toby ate for breakfast. "Then what do you want?" She set the pot down on the table with a dull thud. "You're alive. You're welcome. I mopped up your mess. We're square." Dominic finally looked at her fully. Up close in the daylight, she could see the sheen of cold sweat across his forehead. He was in agony. He was hiding it well. But you didn't spend 3 years in a trauma ward without learning to read the micro-expressions of pain. The tight jaw, the slightly flared nostrils, the shallow, controlled breathing. "We are far from square," Dominic said softly. "My personal physician is dead. He died 3 days ago in a rather unfortunate car accident." Maeve felt the blood drain from her face. "The bullet that put me in this booth 3 weeks ago was a localized effort," Dominic continued, his tone conversational, as if discussing the weather. "Someone very close to me decided it was time for a change in management. My doctor, it seems, was part of that transition plan. He stitched me up, took his fee, and then conveniently prescribed me a course of antibiotics that were entirely saline. He shifted his weight, his face paling another fraction of a degree. He reached into his coat with his good hand, slowly, deliberately unbuttoning the top of his shirt. Maeve didn't want to look, but her eyes dropped automatically. Beneath the shirt, heavy gauze was taped awkwardly over his collarbone. The edges of the white fabric were stained a sickly, yellowish brown. The smell hit her then, faint but unmistakable. Warm, rotting, sweet. Infection. A bad one. "It's necrotic," Maeve whispered, stepping back. "It's getting there," Dominic agreed, buttoning his shirt back up with remarkable calm. "I have a fever of 103. I haven't slept in 4 days. If I go to a hospital, the people who paid my doctor will know I'm vulnerable, and they will finish the job. If I call another doctor into my home, I have to wonder how much it will cost to buy their loyalty." He leaned back, his dark eyes locking onto hers. They were fever-bright, burning with a dangerous intensity. "I don't trust anyone on my payroll right now," Dominic said. "But I trust a desperate mother who jammed her bare hand into my chest to keep a gun away from her kid. You didn't care about my money. You didn't care about my reputation. You just wanted to survive." Maeve shook her head, backing away until her hips hit the counter. "No, absolutely not. I am not a doctor. I am an ER tech who lost her license. I can't treat necrotic tissue, and I won't get involved in a mob war. Go find a dirty vet. Go find someone else." Dominic slowly reached into his pocket. He pulled out a small metallic object and set it on the table. It was a set of keys. A Honda emblem caught the harsh fluorescent light. Maeve checked her pocket. Empty. He had picked her pocket when she poured the coffee, or one of his invisible ghosts outside had taken them from her coat in the break room. "I need discretion, Maeve," Dominic said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming an order rather than a request. "And I need someone who doesn't panic when the blood starts flowing. You start tonight, 10,000 a week, cash, until I am fully healed." "And if I say no?" Dominic's expression didn't change, but the air in the diner seemed to drop 10 degrees. "You won't. Because if I die, the men who take over my city are not the kind who leave loose ends. The people who saw me that night? They will be liabilities, you included." He pushed the keys across the table. Next to them, he placed a small, matte black card with an address printed in silver foil. 8 o'clock. Don't be late. I'm a terrible patient." He stood up, the effort clearly costing him dearly. He leaned heavily on the cane, gave her one last, unreadable look, and walked out the door. The little bell jingled happily behind him. Maeve stared at the keys on the table, the scent of his cologne, and the rotting sickness lingering in the empty diner. The address on the black card wasn't in the city. It was 30 miles north, up in the heavily wooded hills of the Palisades, where the estates sat on acres of private land behind wrought-iron gates. Maeve drove her rattling Honda Civic through the driving rain. It was 7:45 p.m. Toby was spending the night at Mrs. Higgins's apartment downstairs, bought off with a $20 bill from her tip jar and a promise to bake her a lasagna. Maeve's knuckles were white on the steering wheel. Her scrubs, she had dug out her old sterile hospital scrubs from a garbage bag in the back of her closet, smelled slightly of mothballs. She turned onto a private, unmarked, freshly paved road that wound aggressively up a steep incline. Tall, ancient pines flanked the road, creating a tunnel of darkness that her weak headlights barely penetrated. At the end of the road, massive iron gates blocked the path. There was no intercom, no visible guardhouse, just the imposing black metal and a high stone wall topped with discreetly angled security cameras. She stopped the car. Before she could even roll down her window, the gates began to swing inward with a heavy, silent glide. Maeve drove through. The driveway was crushed grey stone, crunching loudly under her tires. It led up to a house that looked less like a home and more like a modern fortress. It was an expanse of dark stone, sheer glass, and sharp architectural angles, nestled aggressively into the side of the mountain. It looked cold, expensive, and utterly devoid of life. She parked near the front steps. The front door, a massive slab of dark oak, opened before she reached it. Elias stood in the doorway. He wore the same tailored look, though tonight it was a dark turtleneck and charcoal slacks. He didn't look surprised to see her. He simply stepped aside. "Miss Collins," Elias said, his gravelly voice echoing slightly in the massive double-height foyer. The floor was polished black marble. It looked like ice. "He is in his suite. Follow me." "Is he conscious?" Maeve asked, clutching a plastic pharmacy bag she had brought with her. It was filled with iodine, sterile saline, heavy-duty gauze, and the strongest over-the-counter pain medication she could find. It was a pathetic arsenal for what she was about to face, but it was all she had. "Barely," Elias said grimly, walking toward a floating glass staircase. "The fever spiked an hour ago. He is delirious. He threw a water glass at my head when I tried to check the bandage. Great. A violent, delirious mobster," Maeve muttered, following him up the stairs. "My favorite kind of patient." Elias paused on the landing, glancing back at her. His grey eyes were analytical. "He requested you specifically. I advised against it. I told him bringing a civilian into the house during an active internal conflict was a catastrophic security risk." "I agree with you," Maeve said instantly. "Tell him that. Let me go home." "But," Elias continued, turning back to the stairs, "Mr. Varga is alive today because of your hands. He believes you are a known variable in a house full of unknowns. I respect his instincts. Do not make me regret doing so." The threat wasn't delivered with malice. It was stated as a simple, unchangeable fact. If she screwed this up, she wouldn't leave the mountain. They walked down a long, dimly lit hallway, adorned with abstract, violent-looking paintings. Elias stopped at double doors at the end of the hall. He pushed them open. The master suite was the size of Maeve's entire apartment building. One wall was floor-to-ceiling glass, overlooking the dark, rain-swept valley below. The room smelled of ozone, fresh linens, and the thick, undeniable stench of sick sweat and decaying flesh. Dominic was in the center of the room, lying on a massive bed with dark grey sheets. He was stripped to the waist. His chest heaved with shallow, rapid breaths. His skin was slick with sweat, his dark hair plastered to his forehead. The muscles in his arms and torso were rigidly tense, fighting a phantom battle in his fevered mind. "Lock the door behind you," Elias said, stepping back into the hallway. "No one comes in but me. If you need supplies, text the number on the burner phone he gave you." The heavy doors clicked shut, plunging Maeve into the quiet of the room. The only sound was the driving rain against the glass and Dominic's ragged breathing. Maeve walked to the edge of the bed. She set her plastic bag on a glass nightstand. She looked down at him. Without the tailored suit, without the imposing posture, he was just a man. A massively built, heavily scarred man, but just a man. She noticed an old, jagged knife scar across his lower ribs and a faded bullet pucker on his left bicep. This wasn't his first times bleeding. She moved to his right side and leaned over, snapping on a pair of blue latex gloves she had pulled from her bag. "Dominic," she said loudly, her voice firm. ER voice. "Dominic, wake up!" He didn't respond. His head thrashed to the side, a low groan escaping his lips. Maeve reached down and gripped his right shoulder, shaking him slightly. Hey, wake up. I need you conscious before I tear this tape off. Dominic's eyes snapped open. For a second, they were wild, unfocused, and terrified. His good hand shot out with terrifying speed, grabbing Maeve by the throat. He didn't squeeze, but the heavy weight of his palm against her windpipe and the grip of his thumb against her carotid artery froze her instantly. Her heart hammered against his palm. He stared at her, his chest heaving, his eyes struggling to focus through the haze of the fever. "It's Maeve," she choked out, forcing her hands to remain at her sides. "Do not fight a delirious patient. De-escalate." From the diner. "Let go of my neck," Dominic blinked. The wildness slowly receded, replaced by a deep, agonizing exhaustion. His hand went slack, dropping from her throat to the mattress. He closed his eyes, exhaling a long, shuddering breath. "You're late," he rasped, his voice raw. "I had to find a babysitter," Maeve snapped, rubbing her neck. "And buy supplies because apparently your multi-million-dollar compound doesn't have a first aid kit. Now sit still. This is going to hurt." "Define hurt," Dominic muttered, turning his head away as she leaned over him with a pair of trauma shears. "Like I'm ripping your skin off with pliers," Maeve replied, sliding the blunt edge of the shears under the thick layers of bloody, yellowed medical tape that bound his chest. Wonderful. Maeve began to cut. The tape was fused to his skin with dried blood and sweat. She worked quickly, methodically, detaching her mind from the fact that the man beneath her hands could have her killed with a single phone call. Right now, he was just a mass of damaged tissue that needed cleaning. She peeled the heavy gauze back. Maeve sucked in a sharp breath through her teeth. It was worse than she thought. The entrance wound near the collarbone was surrounded by a halo of angry, furious red, hot to the touch. The edges of the wound were swollen, leaking thick, purulent fluid. The stitches his traitorous doctor had put in were pulling taut against the inflamed skin, tearing the tissue further. "How bad?" Dominic asked, his eyes still closed. His jaw was clenched so tight the muscle fluttered. "Bad," Maeve said honestly. She picked up a bottle of iodine. "Your doctor didn't just give you fake antibiotics. He closed the wound while it was still dirty. He trapped the infection inside. I have to pull these stitches out, flush the wound cavity, and pack it with sterile gauze. If I don't, the infection will reach the bone or go systemic. Sepsis will kill you by Thursday." Dominic finally opened his eyes. He looked at the ceiling. "Do it." "I don't have anesthetic, Dominic," Maeve warned him, her voice softening slightly despite herself. "I have over-the-counter Tylenol and a bottle of iodine. I am going to be digging inside your chest." "I've had worse," he said. He reached down and gripped the heavy wooden frame of the bedstead with his right hand. His knuckles immediately turned white. "Get it over with." Maeve didn't hesitate. She poured a liberal amount of iodine onto a sterile pad. She picked up a small pair of tweezers from her kit. "Deep breath," she ordered. She clipped the first stitch. Dominic's entire body went rigid. He didn't make a sound, but his breathing stopped completely. Maeve worked with brutal efficiency. She snipped and pulled, 7 stitches. With each one, thick infected blood welled up, spilling over his collarbone. When the wound was open, she picked up a large plastic syringe filled with a mixture of saline and iodine. "This is the bad part," she whispered, leaning over him. Her face was inches from his. She could feel the unnatural heat radiating from his skin. She inserted the plastic tip of the syringe directly into the open bullet hole and depressed the plunger hard. Dominic violently arched off the bed. A choked, guttural roar tore from his throat. His free hand flew up, blindly grabbing the front of Maeve's scrubs, twisting the fabric into a suffocating knot. He pulled her down, instinctively trying to stop the source of the pain. Maeve lost her balance, her knee hitting the mattress. She crashed against his chest, her face buried in the crook of his good shoulder. The heat of him, the smell of his sweat, and the sharp tang of iodine enveloped her. "Hold still!" she yelled against his skin, struggling to stay upright without pushing against the wound. "Let go, Dominic! Let go!" He was thrashing, driven purely by the primal instinct to escape the blinding agony. Maeve dropped the syringe. She grabbed his wrist with both hands, using all her leverage to pry his fingers off her shirt. "Look at me!" she shouted, abandoning the clinical tone entirely. She wasn't a nurse right now. She was a brawler in a diner. She shoved her forearm against his throat, not enough to choke him, but enough to pin his head down. "Look at me, you stubborn bastard!" Dominic froze. His dark eyes, blown wide with pain and shock, snapped to hers. They were chest to chest, breathing heavily, entirely entangled. "I am trying to save your miserable life," Maeve hissed, her face flushed, her hair falling out of its messy bun. "But if you break my neck, you die. I need to flush it 2 more times to get the pus out. Do you understand me? You have to let me hurt you." For a long, agonizing moment, the silence in the room was deafening. The air crackled with a strange, violent electricity. He was staring at her mouth, then up to her eyes. He saw no pity, no fear, just pure, furious determination. A slow, rough exhale shuddered out of his chest. His fingers uncurled from her scrubs. He let his arm drop heavily to the bed. "Do it," he breathed, his voice barely a whisper. He turned his face away from her, exposing his neck, offering her total vulnerability. "Finish it." Maeve pushed herself off his chest, her hands shaking slightly. She picked up the syringe. She refilled it. She flushed the wound 3 more times. Dominic didn't fight her again. He just lay there, silently absorbing the torture, his body vibrating with the effort to remain still. By the time the fluid running out of the wound was clear, he was completely unconscious, his body having finally shut down from the sensory overload and the fever. Maeve slumped back into a leather armchair beside the bed, pulling off her bloody gloves. Her arms felt like lead. Her scrubs were soaked with his sweat, and her own. She looked at the mob boss, currently patched up with cheap drugstore gauze and heavy medical tape, sleeping fitfully on his dark grey sheets. She had done it. She had saved him twice. She leaned her head back against the leather chair and closed her eyes, listening to the rain. She was trapped. She knew it with a cold, absolute certainty. You don't pin a man like Dominic Varga to a bed, scream in his face, and walk away back to your normal life. You become part of his. And as she sat there in the dark, watching the slow, steady rise and fall of his chest, the most terrifying realization wasn't that she was trapped in a Mafia compound. The terrifying part was that, for the first time in 3 years, she didn't feel entirely dead inside. The digital clock on the nightstand clicked to 4:12 a.m. Maeve's eyes felt like they were full of crushed glass. She was slouched in the leather armchair, her chin resting on her chest, staring at the steady rise and fall of Dominic's ribs. The room smelled of rubbing alcohol, stale sweat, and the sharp metallic ozone of the dying storm outside. She had spent the last 8 hours fighting a phantom. Whenever his temperature spiked, he thrashed, tearing at the sheets, muttering names of people Maeve didn't know and orders she didn't understand. She had gone through 2 bags of ice, wrapping cubes in hand towels and pressing them against his neck, his wrists, his groin, anywhere the blood ran close to the surface. She had sponged his chest until her own arms ached. Now, the room was quiet. Maeve leaned forward, her spine popping in protest. She reached out and pressed the back of her bare hand against his forehead. Cool. Damp, but cool. The fever had broken. She let out a long, ragged exhale, sinking back into the chair. She dragged a hand down her face, feeling the oily residue of exhaustion on her skin. She had done it. The infection was localized, the sepsis averted. She just wanted to sleep for a week. "You snore." The voice was a wreck, dry, cracked, and barely above a whisper. Maeve jumped, her heart stuttering. Dominic's eyes were open. The wild, fevered glassiness was gone. They were dark, lucid, and fixed entirely on her. He didn't move his head, just tracked her with his gaze. "I don't snore," Maeve said, her voice defensively flat. "I was wheezing. I inhaled about a pint of your cheap cologne while you were trying to strangle me." Dominic's brow furrowed slightly. He shifted his right arm, slowly lifting his hand. He looked at his own knuckles. Then his eyes dropped to Maeve's neck. Even in the dim light of the bedside lamp, she knew the bruises were blossoming. Dark, purple fingerprints wrapping around her throat. His jaw tightened. A muscle jumped beneath his heavy stubble. "I did that. Don't flatter yourself." "You were delirious," Maeve said, standing up. She walked to the glass nightstand and poured water from a crystal carafe into a glass. "You thought I was someone else. Drink this." She slid her left hand behind his neck, supporting his heavy head, and brought the glass to his lips. He drank greedily, coughing on the last swallow. She lowered him back to the pillows. The physical proximity didn't make her nervous anymore. It just made her tired. "Elias should have sent you away," Dominic murmured, closing his eyes as the water hit his stomach. "It isn't safe here." "Elias tried. I stayed," she lied smoothly, checking the edges of the medical tape on his chest. It was dry, no fresh seepage. "You offered me $10,000 a week. I have rent and a kid who grows out of his shoes every 3 months. I'm not leaving until the job is done." Dominic opened his eyes again. He watched her hands as she catalogued the medical supplies on the table. "What's his name?" Maeve paused, a roll of sterile gauze halfway to the bag. She looked at him. The mobster was asking about her son. It felt like a violation of a very strict, unspoken boundary. "Toby," she said finally, tossing the gauze into the plastic bag. "He's 5. Where is he?" "At a hotel downtown. Elias set it up," Maeve answered, the bitterness leaking out. "Apparently, my apartment building suddenly developed a plumbing issue that flooded my floor. Strange timing." "Elias is thorough," Dominic said, a faint, humorless smile touching the corner of his mouth. "The men who shot me know you pulled me out of the diner. If you had gone back to your apartment, they would have found you. Elias moved your son to keep him off the board." "Keep him off the board," Maeve repeated, the words tasting like ash. "He's a kindergartner, Dominic. Not a chess piece." "In my world, everyone is a piece," Dominic said quietly. The exhaustion in his voice wasn't just physical. It was deep, chronic, and utterly lonely. "You just have to decide who is expendable." He looked at the purple bruises on her neck again, his expression hardening. "You aren't." Maeve stared at him. The hum of the massive central air conditioning unit filled the silence. She should have been terrified. She should have grabbed her bag and demanded Elias drive her to the hotel. But looking at the scarred, ruined man bleeding on expensive sheets, she didn't feel fear. She felt a terrible, heavy understanding. "Go to sleep, Dominic," she said softly, turning off the bedside lamp. "You have a long week ahead of you." By day 4, the sprawling, cold compound had settled into a bizarre domestic rhythm. Maeve operated on a strict schedule. Check the wound, flush the cavity, change the packing, force him to eat. She had taken over the kitchen, a massive, sterile room of brushed steel and white marble that looked like it had never seen a hot meal. Elias and the 4 heavily armed guards rotating outside the perimeter ate catered takeout. Maeve refused to feed a recovering trauma patient sodium-heavy garbage. She stood at the island, chopping a yellow onion with unnecessary force. The heavy thud of the chef's knife against the butcher block echoed in the quiet room. She swept the onions into a hot cast-iron skillet, the sudden, violent hiss of oil filling the air, followed instantly by the sharp, sweet smell of caramelizing sugar. "You're holding the knife wrong." Maeve didn't flinch. She kept stirring the onions with a wooden spoon. Dominic stood in the doorway. He was out of the bed, leaning heavily on his black cane. He wore dark grey sweatpants and a tight, black, short-sleeved Henley. His left arm was still strapped rigidly to his chest in the sling, but the sallow greyness had left his skin. He looked like a retired heavyweight boxer who had taken one too many hits, but still owned the ring. "I'm chopping onions, not performing surgery," Maeve said, not looking back. "Sit down before you tear the internal stitches." He slowly dragged himself to one of the leather bar stools at the island. He sat with a suppressed grunt, hooking the cane over the edge of the counter. He watched her move. She wore her faded pink diner uniform today. She had run out of clean scrubs and refused to wear the expensive tailored clothes Elias had offered to buy her. "Elias gave me your file," Dominic said, resting his good arm on the cold marble. Maeve froze, the wooden spoon stalling in the pan. The onions began to burn slightly at the edges. "My file. Background check. Standard procedure for anyone entering this house." He picked up a stray piece of raw onion from the board, rolling it between his thumb and forefinger. "Maeve Collins, top of your class at nursing school, 3 years in the trauma ward at County General, fired and narrowly avoided criminal charges for stealing pharmaceutical supplies from the lockbox." Maeve turned off the gas burner. The hiss died down to a crackle. She wiped her hands on her apron, turning to face him. Her chin tipped up, defensive and angry. "Toby had strep throat," she said, her voice hard. "It turned into scarlet fever. My insurance wouldn't cover the specific antibiotic he needed because it was off-brand. The generic wasn't working. His fever was 104. So, yes, I swiped a 10-day course of amoxicillin from a multi-billion-dollar hospital conglomerate to keep my son's heart from failing." She waited for the judgment. The lecture on ethics. Dominic just stared at her. His dark eyes flicked over her face, cataloguing the defiance, the protective rage, the total lack of regret. "Good," he said simply. Maeve blinked. "Good? If you had let him suffer because of a hospital policy, I would have thrown you out of this house myself," Dominic said, dropping the piece of onion onto the board. "Rules are constructs for people who can afford them. Survival is the only law that actually matters." He leaned forward, the smell of his clean soap and the faint, lingering scent of iodine bridging the gap between them. "You stole to keep him breathing. You shoved your hand into a dying man's chest to keep a gun out of his face. You're ruthless, Maeve. You just wrap it in a pink uniform." "I am nothing like you," Maeve snapped, her hands gripping the edge of the marble counter. "No," Dominic agreed softly. "You're better. I hurt people to keep what's mine. You save people." He looked at the pan on the stove. "Are those going to burn, or are you going to feed me?" The tension in the room snapped, leaving a strange, echoing void in its wake. Maeve exhaled, shaking her head. She turned back to the stove, flicking the gas back on. "You're a sociopath," she muttered, cracking 3 eggs into a bowl. "I prefer pragmatist," he replied, a genuine low chuckle rumbling in his chest. It was the first time she had heard him laugh. It was a warm, rough sound that completely altered the geometry of his harsh face. Maeve poured the eggs into the pan, watching them scramble. She realized with a sudden, sharp spike of panic that she liked the sound of it. She liked the quiet kitchen. She liked the way he looked at her without pity. She was getting comfortable in the tiger's cage, and she knew exactly how dangerous that was. The illusion shattered on day 7. It started with a smell. Not blood. Not infection. Smoke. Maeve was in the guest room, packing her single duffel bag. Dominic's wound was healing beautifully. The tissue was pink and healthy, the stitches holding. Her job was done. Elias had promised to drive her to the hotel to pick up Toby, and then, she didn't know. A new city, maybe? The envelope of cash was heavy at the bottom of her bag. A sharp, deafening crack echoed through the heavy glass windows. It wasn't thunder. Maeve dropped her bag. She knew that sound from the ER waiting room on Saturday nights. Gunfire. The heavy oak door of the guest room slammed open. Elias stood there, a matte black assault rifle hanging from a tactical sling across his chest. The calm, tailored fixer was gone. He was a soldier now. "Corridor! Now!" Elias barked, not waiting for her to move before turning his back to secure the hallway. Maeve ran. She sprinted barefoot onto the cold marble floor. The house was alive with a chaotic, violent energy. Alarms shrieked, a high, pulsing siren that vibrated in her teeth. The smell of wood smoke and burnt powder drifted up the grand staircase. Dominic was standing at the end of the hall. He was fully dressed in black tactical gear, shrugging a heavy Kevlar vest over his shoulders. He didn't have his cane. He moved with a stiff, agonizing rigidity, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated violence. He shoved a heavy magazine into a handgun, the metallic clack slicing through the sirens. "Elias!" Dominic's voice boomed, carrying over the noise. "Status. They breached the lower gate," Elias reported, sweeping his rifle across the empty foyer below. 3 vehicles, heavy arms. They lit the gatehouse on fire. Local police are bought off. They won't respond for 20 minutes. "Who?" Maeve shouted, pressing herself against the wall. Dominic turned to her. The warmth she had seen in the kitchen was entirely gone. His eyes were dead, flat, and terrifying. The boss had returned. "The men who want my chair," Dominic said. He walked toward her, grabbing her upper arm and shoving her roughly behind him, putting his body between her and the staircase. "Elias, take her to the panic room. Lock her in." "No," Maeve pulled back. "I'm not sitting in a dark box. I need to know what's happening." "This isn't a negotiation, Maeve," Dominic snarled, his grip tightening like a vice. He leaned down, his face inches from hers. "If they get up those stairs, they will put a bullet in your head just for standing next to me. Do as I say." He shoved her toward Elias. Maeve stumbled, catching herself on the wall. Elias grabbed her shoulder and pulled her down a narrow side hallway, swiping a keycard over a hidden panel in the wood trim. A heavy steel door slid open with a hydraulic hiss. "Get in," Elias ordered. Maeve stepped into the stark, concrete room. It smelled heavily of filtered air and old emergency rations. Elias didn't look at her as he hit the heavy red button on the wall. The steel door slid shut, locking with a series of heavy, terrifying thuds. Silence. Absolute, crushing silence. The panic room was entirely soundproof. Maeve sat on the cold steel bench, pulling her knees to her chest. She couldn't hear the gunfire. She couldn't hear the alarms. She just had to sit there and wait to see who opened the door. If it was Dominic, she lived. If it was a stranger, she died. Time ceased to exist. It could have been 10 minutes or 2 hours. Her heart beat a frantic, exhausting rhythm against her ribs. She thought of Toby, playing with building blocks in a hotel room, entirely unaware that his mother was sitting in a concrete bunker waiting for the end. Finally, the hydraulic locks engaged. Maeve shot to her feet, pressing her back against the far wall. The heavy door slid open. Smoke billowed in. Through the haze, a figure stepped into the doorway. It was Dominic. His face was streaked with soot and a fresh spray of blood that wasn't his own. He was breathing heavily, his left arm held awkwardly against his side. The Kevlar vest was scored with white, jagged lines where bullets had caught the fabric. But he was standing. He looked at her, his chest heaving. He dropped the empty handgun onto the floor. It clattered loudly. "It's over," he said roughly. Maeve didn't speak. She walked forward, stepping out of the concrete room and into the ruined hallway. The house smelled like an abattoir. Bullet holes chewed the expensive plaster. The silence now wasn't peaceful. It was the silence of a graveyard. "I need to leave," Maeve said. Her voice trembled, but she forced the words out. "I need to get my son, and I need to disappear." Dominic stepped into her path. He didn't touch her, but his sheer mass blocked the hallway entirely. "You can't go back," he said. His voice dropped the adrenaline, returning to that low, heavy acoustic weight. "They didn't just come for me, Maeve. They came to wipe the slate. Your apartment was firebombed an hour ago." Maeve stopped breathing. The air simply vanished from the hallway. If Elias hadn't moved Toby to the hotel... Dominic didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. Maeve's knees buckled. She didn't fall because Dominic caught her. His right arm wrapped around her waist, pulling her flush against his heavy, tactical vest. He held her upright, absorbing her trembling. "You're in it now," he murmured against her hair, his breath hot against her temple. "You saved my life, and you crossed the line. There is no diner anymore. There is no quiet life. They know your name." "What do I do?" she whispered, her hands gripping the rough fabric of his vest. She wasn't fighting him. She was holding on to the only solid thing left in her burning world. Dominic pulled back just enough to look her in the eyes. His gaze was fierce, possessive, and entirely uncompromising. "You stay with me," he commanded. It wasn't an offer. It was a vow. "I will move you and Toby to a secure estate. I will pay for his schooling. I will surround you with men who will die before they let a stranger look at you. You will never scrub another floor, and you will never look over your shoulder again." Maeve looked at the blood on his face, the smoke in the air, the cold, calculating truth in his eyes. He was a monster. He was a killer. But he was her monster now. She thought of the fire at her apartment. She thought of Toby's empty bed. She looked up at the Mafia boss who had torn her life apart, just to put it back together in his own image. "Okay," Maeve breathed, her voice raw, accepting the gilded cage. "Okay." Dominic's grip tightened on her waist, pulling her into the dark. If you loved the intense, raw conclusion to Maeve and Dominic's story, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Would you have made the same choice as Maeve to protect your family, or would you have run? Let us know in the comments below. Share this video with your fellow romance drama lovers, and make sure you click the notification bell so you never miss our next gripping, deeply human story. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next one.